In the deteriorating streets of Riverside Heights, an 85-year-old Navy veteran was about to face his greatest battle since Vietnam. What started as a quiet evening walk took a shocking turn when 3 Red Serpent gang members demanded protection money. Frank "Gunny" Morrison wasn't your typical elderly retiree. For 40 years, he had mentored young Marines, known for his unwavering moral compass. When he refused their demands, he had no idea he was walking into a brutal assault that would activate a brotherhood spanning generations. Morrison's defiance would trigger an unprecedented military response. Within 12 minutes of the attack, active-duty Marines from Camp Pendleton began converging on the neighborhood with shocking precision. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Frank Morrison's small garden, illuminating the neat rows of tomatoes and peppers that defied the decay surrounding them. At 85, his hands still moved with the precision of a man who understood that order was something you created, not something that happened to you. The soil beneath his fingers was dark and rich, a stark contrast to the cracked concrete and boarded windows that defined most of Riverside Heights. Rosa always said you could tell the character of a neighborhood by its gardens, Frank murmured to himself, adjusting the small American flag that marked the corner where his late wife's roses still bloomed. 5 years since cancer had taken her, and he still found himself speaking to her memory as naturally as breathing. The newspaper lay folded on his porch steps, its headlines screaming about violence in distant places while ignoring the slow-motion collapse happening in his own backyard. Frank settled into his weathered chair with his coffee, turning first to the obituaries, as had become his ritual. Another name he recognized, Sergeant Jim Caldwell, served in the Mekong Delta. Frank raised his mug in a quiet salute before folding the paper. The sound of heavy footsteps on his walkway interrupted the morning quiet. 3 men approached, their red bandanas and serpent tattoos marking them as Red Serpents. The leader, a muscled Latino with gold teeth, carried himself with the swagger of someone who'd never been told no. "Morning, old man!" Gold Teeth's voice carried mock respect. "Name's Viper. We're here about the neighborhood protection fee." Frank set down his coffee with deliberate calm. "Son, I've been protecting this neighborhood since before you were born. Don't recall asking for your help." The younger gangster to Viper's left, barely out of his teens, shifted nervously. "All the businesses on this block pay up, old man. Keeps the troublemakers away." "I see." Frank's voice remained steady. "And who exactly are these troublemakers you're protecting me from?" Viper's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Dangerous world out here. Lot of bad elements. Old folks like you, living alone. Accidents happen." Frank studied the 3 men with the calm assessment of someone who'd faced real threats. "I served 3 tours in Vietnam with the Marines. Came home to work construction for 30 years. Buried my wife in the cemetery 6 blocks from here. This house, this neighborhood, it's mine. I don't pay rent on what I already own." The tension thickened. The youngest gangster glanced at his companions, uncertainty flickering across his features. Viper stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "That was then, Marine. This is now. Times change. Some things don't." Frank met his gaze without flinching. "Honor, loyalty, standing up for what's right, those don't have expiration dates." A police cruiser turned onto the street and Viper cursed under his breath. The 3 men began backing away, but Viper pointed a finger at Frank. "We'll be back, old man. Think about what we discussed." Detective Carlos Mendez emerged from the cruiser, his weathered face showing the strain of too many years fighting a losing battle. He watched the Red Serpents disappear around the corner before approaching Frank's porch. "Mr. Morrison, everything all right here?" Frank poured himself another cup of coffee. "Just some young men who seem confused about how respect works." Mendez climbed the porch steps, accepting the offered chair. At 43, he looked older, his dark hair showing gray at the temples. They've hit 6 businesses this week alone. Protection racket. Most folks just pay. Most folks didn't take an oath to defend what matters. With respect, sir, that oath was to defend the country, not necessarily this particular block. Frank's eyes hardened slightly. Detective, every neighborhood is someone's country. When you stop defending the small places, the big ones don't matter anymore. Mendez nodded slowly. He'd grown up 3 blocks from here, watched the neighborhood's transformation from working-class families to drug corners and abandoned lots. I wish I had more officers to patrol regularly, but you don't. Frank's tone wasn't accusatory, merely factual. Systems overwhelmed. I understand that. Doesn't change what a man has to do. Around noon, Elena Morales arrived with her clipboard and practiced smile. At 32, the social worker carried herself with the determined optimism of someone who refused to accept defeat, even when surrounded by evidence of it. Mr. Morrison, how are you holding up? Still, breathing, which puts me ahead of several folks in today's obituaries. There Frank gestured for her to sit. What brings you by, Elena? She hesitated, her professional demeanor softening. I've been hearing things about the Red Serpents expanding their territory, putting pressure on long-time residents. Young men with more energy than sense, nothing new under the sun. This is different. Elena's voice carried genuine concern. They're getting more aggressive, less worried about police response. Mr. Chen's restaurant paid them $500 last week just to keep his windows intact. Frank's jaw tightened. David Chen's family had run that restaurant for 15 years, serving the community even when most businesses fled to safer neighborhoods. What would you have me do, Elena? I'm an old man with a pension and a vegetable garden. You're also the most respected person in this neighborhood. When you speak, people listen. If you organized the residents, maybe I'd just paint a bigger target on everyone's back. Frank shook his head. Sometimes the best thing an old soldier can do is hold his position and let the young folks figure out their own battles. But Elena caught something in his tone, a hint that suggested Frank Morrison had no intention of retreating from anything. Late afternoon brought Tommy Morrison, no blood relation despite the shared name. At 31, the former Marine still carried himself like a soldier, though the haunted look in his eyes spoke of battles that followed him home from Afghanistan. Frank had taken him under his wing 3 years ago when Tommy returned from his 4th deployment, struggling with nightmares and the kind of survivor's guilt that ate at good men. Gunny, Tommy used Frank's old rank out of habit. Heard you had some visitors today. Word travels fast. Tommy's hands shook slightly as he lit a cigarette, a habit that had replaced other worse coping mechanisms. Elena's worried. So's Detective Mendez. Hell, so am I. You don't need to worry about an old man, son. You're not just an old man. Tommy's voice carried the intensity of someone who'd seen too much. You're the only father figure I've ever had. And this neighborhood, it's all we got left of what home is supposed to feel like. Frank studied the younger man's face, seeing echoes of his own struggles returning from Vietnam decades earlier. Rosa had helped him through those dark months, patient and understanding when he'd wake up fighting shadows. What are you thinking, Tommy? I'm thinking maybe it's time to make some calls. Let folks know what's happening here. What kind? Of calls? Tommy's smile was grim, the kind Marines make when one of their own is in trouble. As evening settled over Riverside Heights, Frank sat in his kitchen, methodically cleaning his service pistol, a ritual Rosa had never quite understood but had learned to respect. The .45 still gleamed with the care of a man who understood that some tools were too important to neglect. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its uneasy nighttime routine. Families locked their doors early. Honest folks stayed inside while other business moved to the streets. Frank assembled the weapon with practiced efficiency, loaded it, and set it in the drawer by his bed. He stood at his bedroom window, looking out at the place he'd called home for 40 years. Most of the streetlights were broken or shot out. Graffiti marked territory lines invisible to outsiders, but clear as road signs to those who knew how to read them. But in the distance, he could see the faint glow from David Chen's restaurant, still serving the community despite the protection money. Mrs. Rodriguez's kitchen light still burned as she prepared tomorrow's lunch for her grandchildren. A few houses down, old Mr. Williams still maintained his small lawn with the same pride Frank brought to his garden. "They think they can scare me off," Frank whispered to Rosa's photograph on the nightstand. "Think an old man won't fight for what matters." He thought about Viper's threat, about the casual way the young gangster had dismissed his service and his right to exist peacefully in his own home, about Elena's worry and Tommy's barely controlled rage, about Detective Mendez's frustrated helplessness in the face of a system that couldn't protect the people it was supposed to serve. Frank Morrison had spent 3 tours in Vietnam, learning that some things were worth fighting for, and 40 years in Riverside Heights, learning that home was one of them. He'd buried his wife in the local cemetery, helped raise neighborhood, kids, and watched good families build lives in these streets. The Red Serpents thought they were dealing with just another elderly mark, someone who would pay up or move away rather than cause trouble. They had no idea they were about to learn the difference between getting old and getting weak, and why some Marines never really retire from the fight that matters most. The night settled deeper around the house, but Frank Morrison wasn't sleeping. He was remembering and planning and preparing for a war he'd hoped never to fight again. The night settled deeper around the house, but Frank Morrison wasn't sleeping. He was remembering and planning and preparing for a war he'd hoped never to fight again. 3 blocks away, in a converted warehouse that served as the Red Serpent's headquarters, Marcus Ripa Torres was receiving reports that would change everything. "The old man told us to go to hell," Viper said, still smarting from the morning's encounter. "Disrespected us in front of the whole neighborhood." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying the 3 men who stood before him like soldiers reporting to their commander. At 28, he'd built the Red Serpents from a handful of corner dealers into the dominant force in Riverside Heights through careful planning and calculated violence. But Frank Morrison represented something different, a challenge to the very foundation of fear that kept his organization in power. "Tell me exactly what he said." Marcus's voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Viper recounted the encounter, his frustration growing with each word. "Called himself a Marine. Said he didn't pay rent on what he already owned. Acted like we were nothing." Marcus's lieutenant, Carlos Razor Martinez, spoke up. "Maybe we let this one slide, Reaper. Old man's got to be 80-something, not worth the heat." But Marcus was already shaking his head. He'd grown up in these same streets, watched his father gunned down in a drive-by when he was 14. The neighborhood had taught him that respect was the only currency that mattered, and Frank Morrison had just declared his worthless. "You don't understand," Marcus said quietly. "It's not about the old man. It's about what happens when word gets out that someone told us no and walked away. How long before Mr. Chen stops paying? Before Mrs. Rodriguez decides she's tired of our protection fees? Before every shopkeeper and homeowner thinks they can stand up to us?" The room fell silent. Marcus stood and walked to the window overlooking the territory he'd claimed through blood and intimidation. In the distance, he could see the lights of Frank Morrison's house, a small beacon of defiance in his carefully ordered world. "The old Marine made his choice," Marcus said finally. "Now he lives with the consequences." Frank's evening walk had been his routine for 20 years, a quiet constitutional through the neighborhood streets that helped him process the day's events. Tonight, as he stepped onto the sidewalk at 8:47 p.m., three figures emerged from the shadows between abandoned houses. They moved with purpose, not the casual swagger of the morning's encounter. Frank recognized Viper immediately, but the other. Two were new, younger, hungrier, with the desperate energy of kids trying to prove themselves. Frank's military training kicked in automatically, assessing angles, distances, potential escape routes. "Evening, gentlemen." Frank's voice remained steady, despite the adrenaline beginning to surge through his system. "Time's up, old man." Viper's gold teeth caught the light from a distant street lamp. "You had your chance to do this easy." Frank's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket pocket, but the youngest attacker was already in motion. The first blow caught him in the ribs, driving the air from his lungs. The second sent him stumbling backward into a chain-link fence. "Please," Frank gasped, playing for time while his mind calculated options. "I'm an old man. You don't need to—" The boot to his stomach cut off his words. Frank doubled over, his 85-year-old body betraying him even as his mind remained sharp. Another kick to his back sent him to his knees on the broken concrete. "Should have paid," Viper said, pulling Frank up by his jacket. "Should have shown respect." The beating was methodical, professional. They avoided his head, smart enough to know that killing an elderly veteran would bring heat they couldn't handle. But the message was clear with every blow to his torso, every kick to his legs. Frank Morrison's defiance would cost him everything. When they finally stopped, Frank lay motionless on the sidewalk, blood trickling from a split lip, his ribs screaming with each shallow breath. The three attackers melted back into the shadows, leaving him alone under the broken streetlight. Tommy Morrison found him 20 minutes later. The former Marine was making his own evening rounds, a habit developed during his deployments, checking on things that mattered. When he saw the figure on the sidewalk, his training took over before his emotions could catch up. "Jesus Christ, Frank!" Tommy dropped to his knees, his hands moving with practiced efficiency to check for life-threatening injuries. "Stay with me, Gunny. I got you." Frank's eyes fluttered open, focusing on Tommy's face with effort. "Tommy!" His voice was barely a whisper. They came back. "Don't talk. I'm calling 911. Tommy's hands shook as he dialed, his PTSD symptoms triggered by the sight of blood and violence. But his training held. "This is Tommy Morrison. I need an ambulance at the corner of Pine and 3rd Street. Elderly male, victim of assault, conscious but injured." The wait for the ambulance felt eternal. Tommy knelt beside Frank, applying pressure to visible wounds while scanning the shadows for signs the attackers might return. In his mind, he was already making other calls, reaching out to the network of Marines who'd stayed in touch since their deployments, men who understood that some bonds transcended military service. Detective Carlos Mendez arrived at the hospital 20 minutes after the ambulance. He found Frank Morrison conscious but battered, giving his statement with the same methodical precision he'd once used to report enemy positions. "3 men," Frank said, his voice raspy but clear. Leader called himself Viper, gold teeth, serpent tattoo on his neck. The others were younger, maybe 16, 17. Mendez took notes, his jaw tightening with each detail. "Can you identify them if you see them again?" Without question, Frank met the detective's eyes. "But we both know identification isn't the problem." Mendez set down his pen, suddenly, looking every one of his 43 years. "Mr. Morrison, I'm going to be straight with you. Even if we arrest them tonight, they'll be back on the street by morning. Maybe with probation, maybe with community service. The system isn't built to protect people like you from people like them." Frank nodded slowly. "I know. That's why this isn't really about the system, is it? Before Mendez could respond, Elena Morales burst through the hospital room door, her professional composure cracking when she saw Frank's condition. "My God, what did they do to you?" "Nothing I didn't expect," Frank replied. "Question is, what happens next?" Elena pulled up a chair, her hands trembling slightly. "The community's already talking. Mrs. Rodriguez saw the ambulance. Word spreading that the Red Serpents finally went after you directly." "Good," Frank said quietly. "Let them talk. Let them understand what we're dealing with." But it was Tommy Morrison who would ensure the conversation expanded beyond Riverside Heights. In the hospital corridor, he pulled out his phone and began making calls that would ripple across Southern California's marine community like stones thrown into still water. "Sergeant Rodriguez, it's Tommy Morrison. I need you to pass. Word through the network. Someone hurt Gunny Frank Morrison tonight. The old Marine from Riverside Heights who's been mentoring guys coming back from deployment." The voice on the other end shifted immediately from casual to deadly serious. "How bad?" "Bad enough. These gang punks think they can intimidate an 85-year-old Marine who's been holding down his neighborhood since before they were born. I'll make some calls." "Make a lot of calls," Tommy said, his voice carrying the edge of barely controlled rage. "Make sure everyone knows what happened here tonight. And make sure they understand that Frank Morrison isn't just some random old man. He's one of ours." As Tommy ended the call, he could see through the hospital room window where Frank was giving his statement to Detective Mendez. The old Marine's back was straight despite his injuries, his voice steady despite the pain. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who'd been tested before and refused to break. But Tommy also knew something else. The Red Serpents had just made the worst mistake of their criminal careers. They'd attacked a Marine who was connected to 3 generations of active duty personnel. They'd violated the one code that transcended rank, service dates, and geographic boundaries. They'd hurt family. In the converted warehouse across town, Marcus Torres was receiving his own phone call, a report from lookouts who'd witnessed the aftermath of the evening's work. Frank Morrison was alive, conscious, and talking to police. The message had been delivered, but something in the way community members were gathering at the hospital suggested this wasn't over. Marcus stared out at the neighborhood lights, a growing unease settling in his chest. For the first time since building his organization, he wondered if he'd miscalculated. The old Marine had seemed like just another obstacle to be removed. But the activity around the hospital, the way people were moving through the streets with purpose rather than fear, suggested Frank Morrison might be more than just one stubborn old man. He'd spent years building his reputation on the principle that violence solved problems. Tonight, he was about to learn that sometimes violence created problems bigger than anyone could imagine. He'd spent years building his reputation on the principle that violence solved problems. Tonight, he was about to learn that sometimes violence created problems bigger than anyone could imagine. The first call reached Staff Sergeant Maria Vasquez at 11:42 p.m. as she was reviewing training schedules in her quarters at Camp Pendleton. The voice on the other end belonged to Corporal Mike Chen, no relation to the restaurant owner, despite the shared surname. "Staff Sergeant, you need to hear this. Tommy Morrison just called about Gunny Frank Morrison." Maria's attention sharpened. Immediately. She'd heard Frank's name countless times during her 8 years of service. Her drill instructor, Sergeant First Class Williams, had spoken of the old Marine with something approaching reverence. Frank Morrison wasn't just a veteran. He was a legend who'd mentored 2 generations of Marines, the kind of man whose influence rippled through the Corps long after his retirement. What happened to Gunny? Gang members beat him down tonight. 85 years old, and these punks put him in the hospital because he wouldn't pay protection money. Maria felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. Where? Riverside Heights, about 40 minutes from base. Maria was already reaching for her uniform. Who else knows? Tommy's working the network, but Maria, he's calling in favors, old favors, the kind that matter. 20 minutes. Later, Maria was driving toward Riverside Heights, her phone buzzing with incoming calls from Marines across Southern California. Each conversation followed the same pattern: disbelief, rage, and the inevitable question, what are we going to do about it? By midnight, Lieutenant Colonel James Iron Patterson was having the worst night of his 23-year career. Reports were flooding in from across his command structure about Marines requesting emergency leave, making unauthorized phone calls, and engaging in what could only be described as intelligence gathering on civilian targets. His aide, Lieutenant Morrison, another Tommy, though this one wore lieutenant's bars, knocked on his office door with the expression of someone delivering news he'd rather not share. "Sir, we have a situation developing." Patterson looked up from the stack of reports, describing increasingly creative interpretations of military regulations. "Define situation, Lieutenant." Approximately 60 Marines from this base alone have either requested emergency leave or announced their intention to visit family in the Riverside Heights area. Intelligence suggests similar activities at Miramar, 29 Palms, and El Toro. Patterson felt a headache building behind his eyes, and the cause of this sudden interest in family visits. "Sir, an 85-year-old retired Marine named Frank Morrison was assaulted tonight by gang members. Morrison apparently mentored dozens of active duty personnel over the years. The network is activated." Patterson had heard of Frank. Morrison, every Marine officer in Southern California had. The old sergeant had an unofficial but widely recognized role as a counselor and father figure for Marines struggling with the transition from military to civilian life. His small house in Riverside Heights had become a kind of sanctuary for young Marines dealing with PTSD, relationship problems, or simply the challenge of maintaining military values in a civilian world. "How bad is this going to get, Lieutenant?" "Sir, with respect, I think it's already gotten as bad as it's going to get. The question is what we do about it." At the same time, Captain Lisa Rodriguez was hunched over her computer in the intelligence office, pulling together everything available on the Red Serpents and their territory. Lisa specialized in urban warfare and counterinsurgency tactics, skills that had proven invaluable in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now she was applying those same analytical tools to a domestic situation that felt disturbingly familiar. The Red Serpents controlled approximately 12 square blocks of Riverside Heights through a combination of drug distribution, protection rackets, and intimidation. Their leader, Marcus Torres, had built the organization methodically over the past decade. Intelligence suggested approximately 40 active members, with perhaps twice that number in associates and part-time affiliates. What made this different from a typical law enforcement problem was the community's response, or lack thereof. Years of ineffective police protection had created a population that had essentially surrendered to gang control. Until tonight. Lisa's phone buzzed with a text from Maria Vasquez. "Need intelligence package on Red Serpents. Comprehensive. 1 hour." Lisa's fingers flew across the keyboard. This was exactly the kind of challenge she'd trained for, developing actionable intelligence to support Marines in hostile territory. The fact that the hostile territory was 40 minutes from Camp Pendleton rather than halfway around the world was irrelevant to her analytical process. In Riverside Heights, Elena Morales was coordinating what could only be described as a civilian intelligence network. Mrs. Rodriguez had called her daughter, who worked as a nurse at the hospital. Mr. Chen had reached out to his supplier network. Small business owners who knew which blocks were safe and which weren't. Even old Mr. Williams, The retired postal worker was sharing 40 years' worth of knowledge about neighborhood patterns and hidden spaces. "Frank Morrison's not just a neighbor," Elena explained to a small group gathered in the hospital waiting area. "He's the reason half the young men in this neighborhood stayed out of gangs. He's the one who talks veterans through their worst nights. He represents everything the Red Serpents are trying to destroy." Elena's phone rang. The caller identified herself as Staff Sergeant Maria Vasquez, U.S. Marine Corps. "Ms. Morales, I understand you're coordinating community response to tonight's attack on Gunny Morrison." Elena felt a chill of possibility mixed with apprehension. "I'm trying to make sure the community doesn't tear itself apart over this. Ma'am, I'm going to be direct. Marines are coming to Riverside Heights. Not officially, not in uniform, but they're coming. We can either work together to make sure this helps your community, or we can let this turn into something nobody wants." Elena looked around the waiting room, at the faces of people who'd lived in fear for too long. "What are you proposing?" "A meeting. Tomorrow morning. Neutral ground. Community leaders and Marine representatives. We figure out how to protect what matters without destroying what we're trying to save." 3 blocks away, David Chen was having his own crisis of conscience. The 22-year-old had joined the Red Serpents at 16 when his family's restaurant faced constant robbery and intimidation. Marcus Torres had offered protection in exchange for loyalty, and David had convinced himself he was keeping his family safe. But tonight's attack on Frank Morrison crossed a line David hadn't known existed. The old Marine had never done anything but nod politely when David delivered takeout orders, treating him with the same respect he showed everyone else in the neighborhood. Frank Morrison represented the possibility that decent people could exist without joining gangs or paying tribute to them. David's younger sister, Amy, was 17, smart enough for college if she could stay away from the gang life that had claimed her brother. David had spent 6 years telling himself he was protecting her by maintaining his position with the Red Serpents. Tonight, for the first time, he wondered if he was actually ensuring her destruction. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "All hands meeting tomorrow. Big changes coming." David stared at the message, then at the family photograph on his dresser. His parents had immigrated from Taiwan with nothing but determination and hope for their children's future. They'd built their restaurant through 18-hour days and absolute commitment to serving their community, and David had betrayed that legacy by joining the very organization that preyed on people like them. But maybe it wasn't too late to choose differently. At Camp Pendleton, Lieutenant Colonel Patterson was making the hardest decision of his career. He could order his Marines to stand down, potentially destroying the morale and brotherhood that made the cause effective. Or he could find a way to channel their loyalty into something that honored both military discipline and the bonds that made them family. Patterson pulled up Frank Morrison's file, unofficial but comprehensive. 3 tours in Vietnam, bronze. Star with V device for valor, 30 years mentoring young Marines after his retirement. Married to Rosa Morrison for 45 years until her death from cancer. No children of his own, but father figure to hundreds of Marines who'd found their way to his door during their darkest moments. Preparing and narrating this story took a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Lieutenant Morrison," Patterson called to his aide, "draft an order. All Marines requesting leave for family emergencies in the Riverside Heights area are to report to Staff Sergeant Vasquez for coordination." "And Lieutenant?" "Yes, sir. Make it clear that any Marine participating in unauthorized activities will face court-martial, but also make it clear that Marines taking care of family properly and within legal boundaries have my full support." As dawn approached, the pieces were moving into position. Marines were converging on Riverside. Heights with a level of coordination that would have impressed their commanding officers if it hadn't violated about 15 different regulations. Community members were sharing information and resources with an efficiency born of desperation and hope. Even some gang members were questioning loyalties they'd never thought to examine. And in his hospital bed, Frank Morrison lay awake, listening to the sounds of a neighborhood in transition. He could hear vehicles moving with purpose rather than menace, voices coordinating rather than threatening, the subtle shift from fear to determination that he'd witnessed in combat zones decades earlier. The Red Serpents had wanted to make an example of him. Instead, they'd awakened something they didn't understand and couldn't control. The brotherhood that had sustained Frank Morrison through 3 tours in Vietnam was about to remind everyone involved why Marines never leave their own behind. The only question now was whether Riverside Heights would emerge from the coming confrontation stronger or completely destroyed. The only question now was whether Riverside Heights would emerge from the coming confrontation stronger or completely destroyed. At 05:47 hours on Thursday morning, that question would begin to be answered in a span of exactly 12 minutes that would transform everything. The countdown began when Staff Sergeant Maria Vasquez received confirmation that Frank Morrison was stable and alert. She stood in the hospital parking lot, her phone pressed to her ear as she spoke with Marines across 3 military installations. "Gunny's going to be fine," she reported to the network. "But that's not the point anymore, is it?" The response was immediate and unified. This wasn't about revenge. It was about protection, about ensuring that what happened to Frank Morrison never happened to anyone else under their watch. About honoring the man who'd helped so many of them find their way home from their own wars. 12 minutes, Maria announced into her phone. "From my mark, we establish presence. Remember, we're family visiting family. Nothing more, nothing less. But family doesn't let family stand alone." 11 minutes, 47 seconds remaining. At Camp Pendleton, Lieutenant Colonel Patterson stood at his office window, watching vehicles leave the base with a frequency that would have triggered security. Alerts if anyone was paying attention to patterns rather than individual departures. His phone rang. "Sir, this is Sergeant Major Williams at Miramar. Thought you should know. We've got unusual movement here too. Marines heading inland, all with family emergency leave requests." Patterson closed his eyes. "How many?" 43 so far. All headed in the same general direction. Sergeant Major, I'm going to ask you to do something that might end both our careers. Sir, coordinate with them. Make sure they're not operating independently. Whatever's about to happen, it needs to happen right, or it's going to destroy everything we've built. 9 minutes, 12 seconds remaining. In the Red Serpent's warehouse, Marcus Torres was receiving reports that made no sense individually, but painted a terrifying picture collectively. Lookouts had spotted unmarked vehicles with military-bearing occupants moving through the outer edges of their territory. Not police. These men moved with a different kind of purpose, a precision that spoke of training beyond civilian law enforcement. "How many?" Marcus asked his lieutenant, Razor Martinez. "Hard to say. They're not bunching up, not making themselves obvious, but—" Razor hesitated. "Reaper, I counted at least 20 vehicles in the last hour, all different routes, all different timing. This isn't random." Marcus felt the first real fear he'd experienced since taking control of the neighborhood. The old Marine had seemed like such a simple target, but the response was unlike anything in his experience, organized, methodical, and completely outside the normal patterns of gang conflict or police response. 7 minutes, 33 seconds remaining. Elena Morales sat in the community center she'd been, trying to revitalize for 3 years. Her phone ringing constantly as neighbors reported seeing official-looking people in their area. But these weren't police or federal agents. They were asking different questions, showing different identification, demonstrating a level of respect for the community that law enforcement had never displayed. "Mrs. Rodriguez, what exactly did they want to know?" Elena asked. "About Frank, about how long he'd lived here, what he meant to the neighborhood, about who was afraid and why." They listened, Mija, really listened, like they cared about the answers. Elena felt something she'd almost forgotten, hope mixed with genuine possibility for change. 5 minutes, 58 seconds remaining. David Chen stood at his bedroom window, watching the subtle transformation of his neighborhood. The changes were almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. Vehicles parked with clear sightlines, individuals positioned at strategic corners, the kind of presence that suggested protection rather than occupation. His sister Amy appeared beside him. "David, what's happening out there?" David made a decision that would change everything for his family. "Amy, get Mom and Dad. We're leaving the restaurant closed today, and we're going to have a conversation about the future." 4 minutes, 21 seconds remaining. Captain Lisa Rodriguez had transformed her intelligence workspace into a command center, coordinating information flows between Marine units and community contacts with the efficiency of a seasoned operations officer. Her screens showed real-time positioning of friendly forces, because that's what they were now, whatever the legal technicalities might be. "Maria, you've got clear approaches from the north and west. Tommy Morrison's team is establishing overwatch. Positions on the high ground. Community liaisons are in place at all major intersections." "Copy that, Lisa. Any signs of hostile response?" "Red Serpents are definitely aware something's happening, but they're staying inside their primary compound. They know they're outmatched, they just don't know by how much." 2 minutes, 47 seconds remaining. Detective Carlos Mendez sat in his patrol car, 3 blocks from Frank Morrison's house, watching the most disciplined civilian operation he'd ever witnessed unfold around him. His radio crackled with confused reports from other officers about possible federal activity in Riverside Heights. But Mendez knew better. These weren't federal agents. These were Marines, and they were operating with a level of coordination that spoke of something far more powerful than official authority. They were operating with shared purpose. Mendez's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Detective, we need to talk. Community Center 0600. Come alone, but come ready to work together." 1 minute, 03 seconds remaining. Frank Morrison lay in his hospital bed, listening to reports from Tommy Morrison about the developing situation. Despite his injuries, Frank's mind was sharp, and he understood the implications of what was happening. "Tommy, you need to make sure they understand. This isn't about vengeance. It's about protection, about giving good people the space to be good, without fear. I know, Gunny. Maria Vasquez is coordinating everything. She gets it. They all get it." Frank nodded slowly. Rosa would have loved this. Marines taking care of community taking care of Marines. That's how it's supposed to work. 0 minutes, 0 seconds remaining. At exactly 0559 hours, the transformation was complete. Riverside Heights had acquired a protective presence that was simultaneously invisible and unmistakable. Marines in civilian clothes occupied positions that provided overwatch without intimidation. Community members emerged from hiding with the confidence that came from knowing someone was finally watching their backs. The Red Serpents found themselves surrounded not by an invading force, but by a community that had remembered how to stand up for itself with the backing of people who understood both courage and discipline. Marcus Torres stood at his warehouse window, staring out at a neighborhood that had changed overnight. The Marines hadn't come for war. They'd come to create space for peace. But the message was clear: harm Frank Morrison or anyone else under their protection, and face consequences that no gang could imagine or survive. 0 minutes, 12 seconds after completion. Maria Vasquez keyed her radio. All stations, this is actual. Perimeter established. Community secure. Phase 1 complete. The response came from positions throughout Riverside Heights. Copy, actual, standing by. In 12 minutes, a gang-controlled neighborhood had become a marine-protected community. The Red Serpent still occupied their warehouse, but they no longer controlled the streets. Frank Morrison still lay in a hospital bed, but he was no longer isolated and vulnerable. The real work was just beginning. The real work was just beginning. At 600 hours, as the sun cast its first light across Riverside Heights, the carefully orchestrated marine presence faced its first test, establishing rules of engagement that would protect the community without creating the very occupation they were trying to prevent. Captain Lisa Rodriguez arrived at the community center first, her civilian clothes doing nothing to hide the bearing of an officer accustomed to command. She'd spent the drive from Camp Pendleton reviewing counterinsurgency doctrine, but applying. Those lessons to domestic community protection required a delicate balance she'd never attempted before. Elena Morales was waiting with coffee, and the kind of nervous energy that came from seeing impossible possibilities suddenly within reach. Captain Rodriguez, I have to ask, is this legal? Ms. Morales, let's focus on what's effective and sustainable. Legal is a conversation for lawyers and politicians. Right now, we need to establish protocols that protect your community without creating problems that outlast our presence. Detective Carlos Mendez arrived next, his expression carefully neutral. 20 years of police work had taught him to recognize when situations moved beyond traditional law enforcement capabilities. The marine presence wasn't technically illegal. They were civilians visiting a neighborhood, nothing more. But the coordination and purpose behind their presence created a reality that no existing legal framework adequately addressed. Detective Rodriguez acknowledged him with professional courtesy. We need to establish communication protocols. My people will respect your jurisdiction, but we need assurance that response times won't leave community members vulnerable. Mendez set down his coffee, choosing his words carefully. Captain, my response times are limited by manpower and resources. If your people are providing security that prevents crimes from occurring, I'm not going to ask too many questions about methodology. The door opened to admit Staff Sergeant Maria Vasquez, followed by Tommy Morrison and 3 other Marines whose civilian clothes couldn't disguise their military precision. Maria carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd successfully managed the impossible overnight, coordinating 60-plus Marines across multiple installations without triggering official attention or community alarm. Ma'am, Maria addressed Elena. We've established initial security protocols, but we need community input on sustainable engagement rules. This only works if it serves your neighborhood's actual needs. Elena spread a hand-drawn map of Riverside Heights across the table. Red X's marked known Red Serpent strongholds, while blue circles indicated homes of elderly residents, families, with children and small businesses that form the community's economic backbone. Our biggest problem isn't just the protection racket, Eleanor explained. It's the fear. Families don't let their children play outside. Businesses close early. People don't talk to each other because they're afraid of being seen as informants or troublemakers. Rodriguez studied the map with the analytical eye of an intelligence officer. What we need is a presence that creates space for normal community life without appearing to be military occupation. Hearts and minds, but domestic application. Tommy Morrison leaned forward. Gunny always said the best security is the kind people don't notice until they need it. We need to be part of the community, not separate from it. Agreed, Maria said. We've got Marines with relevant skills, mechanics, electricians, teachers, people who can contribute while maintaining security overwatch. Mendez raised a concern that had been nagging at him since dawn. What happens when the Red Serpents test your resolve? They're not going to just accept this new reality without pushing back. Rodriguez's smile was grim. Detective, we've spent the last 15 years learning how to deal with insurgents who thought they could intimidate their way to control. The Red Serpents are amateurs compared to what we faced in Fallujah. But Elena caught something in the captain's tone that worried her. Captain, we can't turn this neighborhood into a war zone. These are families, not military objectives. Which is exactly why our rules of engagement need to be more restrictive than anything we used overseas, Rodriguez replied. Zero tolerance for escalation, minimum necessary force, priority on de-escalation and community protection over tactical advantage. Maria nodded. We've already briefed all personnel. They're here as protective family members, not as combattee. Troops. Any deviation from community protection protocols results in immediate removal from the operation. Meanwhile, 3 blocks away, Lieutenant Colonel Patterson was arriving at the Red Serpent warehouse for a conversation that would define the next phase of the crisis. He wore his dress uniform, every ribbon and rank insignia clearly visible, accompanied by 2 military police officers who remained at parade rest beside their vehicle. Marcus Torres met him at the warehouse entrance, his own lieutenants flanking him in a display of gang solidarity that suddenly seemed pathetically inadequate compared to the disciplined authority facing him. Mr. Torres, Patterson's voice carried, the kind of authority that made civilians instinctively straighten. I believe we need to discuss the new realities of this neighborhood. Marcus tried to project the confidence that had served him for years. I don't know what you think is happening here, but this is still my territory. Son, let me explain something to you. Patterson stepped closer, his voice dropping to the tone officers used when discussing life and death matters. Last night, you made the mistake of attacking a United States Marine. Not just any Marine, one who's mentored hundreds of active duty personnel over the past 40 years. Marcus felt his certainty beginning to crack. It was business, nothing personal. Everything involving Marines is personal, Patterson replied. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to order your people to stand down from any activities that threaten community members. You're going to cease all protection rackets, intimidation tactics, and territorial enforcement in this neighborhood. And if I refuse? Patterson's smile was colder than anything Marcus had ever seen. Son, you've got maybe 40 gang members. I've got access to 40,000 Marines, and every one of them now knows that Frank Morrison is under our protection. How do you think that math works out? Marcus looked past Patterson at the Marines positioned throughout the neighborhood, not hiding, but not advertising their presence either. Professional, disciplined, and absolutely committed to their mission. What about our business operations? Marcus asked, grasping for negotiating position. What you do outside this neighborhood is between you and Detective Mendez. What you do inside this neighborhood involves people under Marine protection. Choose accordingly. Back at the community center, the rules of engagement were taking final shape. Marines would maintain security through community service, helping with repairs, providing technical skills, and maintaining visible but non-threatening presence. Community members would serve as liaisons, ensuring that Marine activities supported rather than replaced neighborhood initiatives. Elena felt cautiously optimistic for the first time in years. So we're essentially creating a community military partnership. Exactly, Rodriguez confirmed, but with clear boundaries. We provide security and resources. You maintain community leadership and decision-making authority. This is your neighborhood. We're just helping you reclaim it. Detective Mendez added his own commitment. And law enforcement will coordinate rather than compete, Any criminal activity gets processed through proper channels, but with response times that reflect the new security realities. As the meeting concluded, Frank Morrison was being discharged from the hospital into a neighborhood transformed overnight from gang territory into protected community. Tommy Morrison helped him into a vehicle surrounded by Marines who'd taken leave specifically to ensure their mentor's safe return home. Frank looked out at streets where children were already beginning to emerge from houses, where Mrs. Rodriguez was sweeping her front steps without constantly checking for threats, where Mr. Chen was actually opening his restaurant on schedule rather than cowering behind locked doors. Rosa would have loved this, Frank said quietly. Community taking care of community. Gunny, Tommy replied, this is just the beginning. Wait until you see what we're going to build here. The rules of engagement were established. The Marines were committed. The community was awakening. And the Red Serpents were learning that some lines once crossed changed everything forever. Now came the real test, proving that protection could evolve into lasting positive change. Now came the real test, proving that protection could evolve into lasting positive change. Within 48 hours of Frank Morrison's return home, Riverside Heights was experiencing something it hadn't seen in over a decade, the emergence of a community that dared to hope. The transformation began with small acts of courage that rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. Mrs. Rodriguez, emboldened by the sight of Marines helping Mr. Chen repair his restaurant's broken windows, decided to plant flowers in the small patch of dirt outside her apartment building. For 3 years, she'd avoided any activity that might draw attention to her home. Now, with Marines providing subtle security from positions that looked like casual conversation clusters, she felt safe enough to make her small corner of the world beautiful again. Elena Morales arrived at the community center that morning to find a line of residents waiting to speak with her, something that hadn't happened since she'd started working in Riverside Heights. The difference was palpable. People stood straighter, made eye contact, spoke without constantly checking over their shoulders for threats. "Ms. Morales," said James Williams, the retired postal worker who'd lived in the neighborhood for 35 years. "My grandson wants to come visit this weekend. First time in 2 years I felt safe having him here." Elena felt tears threatening as she realized the magnitude of what was happening. These weren't just individual acts of courage, they were the foundation stones of a community reclaiming itself. At the same time, Staff Sergeant Maria Vasquez was coordinating the most unusual duty assignment of her Marine career. She stood in Frank Morrison's living room, surrounded by Marines who were receiving briefings on community service protocols rather than combat operations. "Corporal Martinez, you're assigned to the community center. Elena Morales needs help organizing after-school programs for local kids. Your job is security liaison, but your cover is volunteer coordinator. Understood, Staff Sergeant. What about engagement rules if Red Serpent members approach?" "De-escalation first, always. These kids live here. Some of them have family. Members in the gang. We're not here to start a civil war. We're here to provide alternatives." Sergeant Mike Chen raised his hand. "Staff Sergeant, what about the older residents who want to help but are afraid of retaliation?" Maria smiled. "That's where community meetings come in. Tonight, 7 p.m., Community Center, first public gathering in this neighborhood in 3 years. We provide security, residents provide courage." The announcement of the community meeting spread through Riverside Heights with remarkable speed. Elena had expected maybe 20 people to show up. By 6:30 p.m., nearly 80 residents had gathered in and around the community center, many bringing folding chairs and home-cooked food, as if this were a block party rather than a political assembly. Frank Morrison arrived, leaning on Tommy's arm, his face still showing bruises from the attack, but his bearing unchanged. The crowd's reaction was immediate and powerful, sustained applause that spoke of years of suppressed gratitude, finally finding expression. "Friends," Frank said when the applause died down, his voice carrying clearly despite his injuries. "3 nights ago, I thought I was just an old man refusing to be pushed around. Tonight, I realize I was part of something much bigger." He gestured toward the Marines positioned around the perimeter, visible but unobtrusive, professional but clearly protective. These young men and women didn't come here for revenge. They came here because they understand what I'm just beginning to see, that protecting each other isn't just what Marines do, it's what communities do. Elena stepped forward, her clipboard filled with concerns and suggestions collected over 2 days of unprecedented neighborhood engagement. "We need to talk about what we want this community to become, not just what we want to stop, but what we want to build." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Riverside Heights had experienced in years. Residents who'd barely spoken to each other began collaborating on ideas for youth programs, neighborhood watch groups, small business development, and community gardens. The Marines listened without interrupting, occasionally offering resources or expertise, but never attempting to lead the discussion. Mrs. Rodriguez stood up, her voice trembling slightly. "I want my grandchildren to be able to play in the park without me worrying they'll step on drug needles. I want to walk to the store after dark without calling my daughter to make sure someone knows where I am." "That's exactly what we're going to make happen," Elena replied. "But it requires all of us staying involved, staying committed, even after the immediate crisis passes." David Chen had been sitting in the back of the room, torn between his gang obligations and his growing desire to support the community transformation. During a break in the formal discussion, he approached Elena quietly. "Ms. Morales, I need to talk to you about something important. Something that could help, but might also put me in danger." Elena studied his face, recognizing the struggle between fear and conscience. "David, are you ready to make a choice about what kind of person you want to be?" "I think I made that choice when I saw them beat up Mr. Morrison. I just need help making it stick." Elena introduced David to Sergeant Chen, who would serve as his primary contact for information sharing. But more importantly, she connected him with Maria Vasquez, who had experience helping young people transition away from dangerous situations. "David," Maria said quietly, "what you're considering isn't just brave, it's essential. But we need to do this right, which means protecting you and your family while ensuring the information you provide actually helps the community." Meanwhile, the gang's response to the community meeting was swift and predictable. Reza Martinez, Marcus Torres's most aggressive lieutenant, had been pushing for violent retaliation since the Marines' arrival. The sight of neighborhood residents openly organizing under Marine protection pushed him past his breaking point. "This is our territory," Reza argued during an emergency Red Serpent meeting. "We let them have one meeting. Pretty soon they're running the whole neighborhood without us." Marcus Torres found himself caught between his lieutenant's demands for action and his own growing recognition that the Marines represented a level of organized response his gang couldn't match. The old rules no longer applied. Violence had always been his primary tool for maintaining control, but violence against people under Marine protection would bring consequences no gang could survive. "What do you suggest?" Marcus asked, though he already knew he wouldn't like the answer. "We hit the meeting, show everyone that Marines or no Marines, we're still in charge here." "And then what? Fight a war against the entire US military? Then we remind everyone why they were afraid of us in the first place." Marcus stared out at the neighborhood, where people were walking home from the community meeting without fear, where children were playing in streets that had been no-go zones just days earlier, where his own control was evaporating like morning mist. For the first time since building his organization, Marcus Torres wondered if the power he'd fought so hard to achieve was worth the price everyone else had to pay. But Reza Martinez had already made his decision. With or without Marcus's approval, the Red Serpents were going to remind Riverside Heights exactly what happened to communities that forgot their place. The community meeting ended with commitments to weekly gatherings, formation of resident committees, and plans for neighborhood improvement projects that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. As residents walked home under marine protection, they carried something more precious than security. They carried hope. But hope, as they were about to learn, sometimes makes the most dangerous enemies. But hope, as they were about to learn, sometimes makes the most dangerous enemies. The test came 72 hours after the first community meeting, when Reza Martinez decided that Marcus Torres's cautious approach was destroying everything the Red Serpents had built. The morning started peacefully enough. Elena Morales arrived at the community center to find Marines already helping residents set up for the weekend youth program, the first organized activity for neighborhood children in over 3 years. Corporal Martinez, no relation to the gang, lieutenant despite the shared surname, was teaching a group of 8-year-olds basic first aid, while Sergeant Chen organized art supplies donated by families from across the base. Frank Morrison sat in his usual chair, still moving carefully due to his injuries, but serving as the unofficial grandfather figure for children who'd never had safe adult supervision. His presence had become a symbol of the community's transformation, proof that decent people could live without fear if they stood together. David Chen watched from across the street, torn between his desire to join the community activities and his fear of exposing his evolving loyalties to gang surveillance. His younger sister Amy had begged him to let her attend the youth program, and David was beginning to realize that his gang membership was the only thing preventing his family from participating in the neighborhood's renaissance. But 3 blocks away, Reza Martinez was planning to end the community's hopeful experiment with a demonstration of violence that would remind everyone why the Red Serpents had controlled Riverside Heights for so long. "We hit them during the kids' program," Reza explained to the 8 gang members he'd recruited for the operation. "Maximum psychological impact. Show the Marines that their protection doesn't mean anything when we're willing to escalate." The plan was simple and brutal. Drive-by shooting targeting the community center during peak activity, then disappear into the network of abandoned buildings that honeycombed the Red Serpent territory. The Marines might be good, but they couldn't be everywhere at once, and they couldn't pursue into areas where civilians might be caught in crossfire. What Reza didn't know was that David Chen had been feeding intelligence to the Marines for 2 days, and that his warning about increased gang activity had triggered enhanced security protocols throughout the neighborhood. At 10:47 a.m., David's text reached Sergeant Chen. "Something happening today. Reza recruiting for operation. Family event might be target." The message was forwarded immediately to Staff Sergeant Vasquez, who was coordinating security from a position that provided overwatch of the community center. Maria's response was swift and professional. Alert all Marine positions, implement lockdown protocols, and prepare for contact while maintaining the appearance of normal community activities. "All stations. This is actual," Maria spoke quietly into her radio. "Possible threat to community center. Implement Charlie protocols. Maintain cover but prepare for immediate response." The response was invisible to community members, but comprehensive. Marines who'd been helping with children's activities shifted to positions that provided both cover and clear fields of fire. Residents were subtly guided away from windows and toward the center's reinforced areas. Frank Morrison, despite his protests, was moved to a secure position where he could continue interacting with children while remaining protected. Detective Carlos Mendez, monitoring police radio frequencies, caught wind of unusual gang communications and began moving patrol units toward Riverside Heights, carefully so as not to trigger early action, but positioned to respond if the situation escalated beyond marine capabilities. At 11:23 a.m., 3 vehicles filled with Red Serpent members approached the community center from different directions. Reza Martinez rode in the lead car, an AR-15 rifle across his lap, convinced that a show of overwhelming force would shatter the Marines' protective illusion and restore gang control over the neighborhood. He was about to learn the difference between gang intimidation and military precision. The first sign that his plan was failing came when he realized the streets were too quiet. No civilians walking around, no children playing outside, no Marines visible in their usual positions. The neighborhood felt empty in a way that suggested preparation rather than abandonment. "Where is everyone?" asked Carlos, the 19-year-old driver who'd joined the Red Serpents only 6 months earlier. "Doesn't matter," Reza replied, though he was beginning to feel uneasy. "We hit the center, send the message, get out." But as the 3 vehicles turned onto the street containing the community center, they found themselves facing something none of them had anticipated. Marcus Torres, standing alone in the middle of the road with his hands raised. Reza slammed his hand against the dashboard. What the hell is he doing? Marcus Torres had spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with the choice between gang loyalty and community responsibility. The sight of children playing safely in streets his organization had terrorized for years. The knowledge that elderly residents like Frank Morrison were finally living without fear. The realization that his leadership had created suffering rather than protection. All of it had culminated in a decision that would define the rest of his life. "Reza, stop the car!" Marcus called out, his voice carrying the authority he'd built over 10 years of gang leadership. "Get out of the way, Marcus. This needs to happen." "No," Marcus replied, walking toward the lead vehicle. "It doesn't." Behind him, Marines began emerging from concealed positions, not threatening, but clearly prepared. Frank Morrison appeared at the community center entrance, flanked by Elena Morales and surrounded by residents who'd chosen to stand with their protectors rather than hide from the confrontation. "Reza, look around," Marcus said, his voice carrying a weariness that spoke of years spent choosing violence over alternatives he'd never allowed himself to consider. "Look at what we're about to destroy. We're about to restore order," Reza snapped. "Show these people who really runs this neighborhood. By shooting children, by terrorizing families, by proving that everything people say about us is true." Maria Vasquez stepped forward, her bearing calm but ready. "Mr. Torres, we don't want anyone to get hurt today, but we won't allow threats to this community." Marcus looked at the Marine staff sergeant, then at the gang members in the vehicles behind him, then at the community center where children were watching through windows with the kind of trust he'd never inspired in anyone. "Reza, stand down. That's an order." "You're not giving orders anymore, Marcus." Reza raised his rifle. "You've gone soft, forgotten what it takes to maintain respect." But before Reza could complete his threat, David Chen appeared from behind the vehicles, having approached from the gang's blind spot. Over the next 6 hours, Marcus Torres provided the most comprehensive intelligence briefing on gang operations that law enforcement had ever received in Riverside Heights. Names, locations, financial structures, supplier networks, and detailed information about criminal activities going back 5 years. But more importantly, he provided insight into why the Red Serpents had been able to establish control in the first place. "People joined us because we offered what the system couldn't," Marcus explained to the assembled group. "Protection for their families, income when legitimate work wasn't available, respect when society treated them as invisible. We filled gaps that should never have existed." Elena took notes rapidly, recognizing patterns that aligned with her own observations. About community needs. What would have made a difference? What could have prevented the Red Serpents from taking control? Jobs that paid enough to support families. Police response times that made people feel safe calling for help. Youth programs that gave kids alternatives to street life. Community centers that stayed open past 5 p.m. Basic services that showed people their neighborhood mattered to someone. Frank Morrison listened with the attention of someone who'd spent decades mentoring young men struggling with similar choices. Son, you're describing symptoms of abandonment. When communities feel abandoned, they create their own protection systems. Sometimes those systems become the problem. By evening, the immediate crisis had transformed into something more complex, but ultimately more hopeful. A comprehensive community development initiative with law enforcement cooperation, military support, and reformed gang leadership providing inside knowledge of systemic problems. David Chen had spent the day helping his family prepare for a future without gang protection or gang obligations. His parents, initially terrified by their son's decision to break with the Red Serpents, began to understand that their restaurant could operate safely for the first time in 6 years. David, his mother said, as they prepared dinner for the first time without fear of gang retaliation, your father and I came to this country so our children could choose their own paths. Today you finally made that choice. Amy Chen, 17 and college-bound, hugged her brother with tears in her eyes. I was so afraid I'd lose you to their world. Now maybe you can help other kids avoid making the same mistakes. The emotional center of the day's reckoning came when Tommy Morrison brought Frank Morrison home from the community center where he'd spent hours talking with former gang members about the possibility of redemption and positive change. Frank's house had been transformed into an unofficial headquarters for the Community Development Initiative. Marines coordinated security from his living room, while Elena organized social services from his kitchen. Detective Mendez used Frank's dining room table to process paperwork for gang members seeking to leave criminal life. Rosa would have loved this chaos, Frank said to Tommy, as they surveyed the organized confusion filling every room of the house. She always said home wasn't about quiet, it was about purpose. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson arrived as the sun was setting, bringing official recognition of what his Marines had accomplished and formal authorization for ongoing community support operations. Gunny Morrison, Patterson said, using Frank's old rank with the respect it deserved. What started here is going to become a model for community military partnerships across the country. You've given us a way to serve that honors both military values and civilian needs. Frank shook the officer's hand, then gestured toward the activity surrounding them, Marines and civilians working together, former gang members seeking legitimate alternatives, community members planning for a future they'd never dared imagine. Colonel, this isn't about what one old Marine did. This is about what happens when good people decide they're not going to accept the unacceptable anymore. As the day ended, Razor Martinez and 6 hardcore Red Serpent members were arrested on weapons charges and outstanding warrants, but 12 other gang members, following Marcus Torres' example, had voluntarily entered community service programs designed to provide alternatives to criminal life. The neighborhood that had witnessed a brutal assault just 1 week earlier was ending the day with former enemies working together to build something better than either could have created alone. The reckoning was complete. Justice had been served, not through vengeance, but through the harder work of addressing root causes and creating sustainable change. The real test would be whether the transformation could last beyond the immediate crisis that had created it. The real test would be whether the transformation could last beyond the immediate crisis that had created it. 6 months after Frank Morrison's attack Riverside Heights had become something unprecedented, a neighborhood where former gang members worked alongside Marines to mentor at-risk youth, where community meetings drew larger crowds than local churches, and where children played in streets that had been war zones just months earlier. The changes were visible from the moment visitors entered the neighborhood. Fresh murals covered walls that had been tagged with gang graffiti. Community gardens flourished in lots that had been drug distribution points. Small businesses stayed, open past sunset for the first time in over a decade, their owners confident that Marine security partnerships and reformed gang member intelligence networks would protect them from the territorial disputes that plagued surrounding areas. Frank Morrison had become something he'd never intended to be, a symbol of community resistance and renewal. His small house served as unofficial headquarters for what everyone called the Riverside Heights model, a community development approach that was being studied by urban planners, military strategists, and social workers from across the country. "I just refused to be pushed around," Frank told the delegation of city officials who'd come to observe the neighborhood transformation. Everything else grew from that one decision. Elena Morales had evolved from neighborhood social worker to regional community development coordinator, advising similar initiatives in gang-affected areas throughout Southern California. Her success in Riverside Heights had proven that community organizing could work when backed by adequate security and genuine resources. The key insight, Elena explained to visiting officials, is that communities don't need to be saved by outsiders. They need protection and resources that allow them to save themselves. Marcus Torres had become the most unlikely success story of the entire initiative. After providing intelligence that led to the dismantling of 3 rival gang operations, he'd completed community service requirements and enrolled in a job training program that led to work as a community liaison for at-risk youth. His transformation from gang leader to youth mentor had inspired other reformed criminals throughout the region. "I spent 10 years teaching kids that violence was the only way to earn respect," Marcus said during a community meeting celebrating the 6-month anniversary of the transformation. "Now I get to teach them that respect comes from protecting what matters instead of destroying it." David Chen had become the bridge between former gang members and community integration programs. His family's restaurant had become an informal headquarters for reformed criminals seeking legitimate employment, with his parents providing meals and encouragement for young men learning to navigate life without gang protection. "Reza, there's something you need to know about the Marines' backup." "David, what are you doing here?" "I'm choosing a side," David replied, "and I'm choosing the side that wants my sister to have a future." The standoff stretched for long. Seconds, Marines ready but restrained, community members frightened but refusing to hide, gang members uncertain about loyalties they'd never questioned, and Marcus Torres facing the choice between the power he'd built through fear and the possibility of redemption through service. The decision came when 8-year-old Maria Rodriguez, Mrs. Rodriguez's granddaughter, broke away from the community center and ran toward Frank Morrison, who'd positioned himself between the gang and the building. "Abuelo Frank," she called, using the Spanish word for grandfather that she'd begun applying to the old Marine. "Are we safe?" Frank Morrison looked down at the child, then up at the armed men threatening everything the community had built in. Just 1 week. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who'd faced much worse threats and refused to be moved by them. "Yes, sweetheart, we're safe, because good people don't let bad things happen to children." It was Marcus Torres who lowered his weapon first, his decision made by the sight of a child running toward danger because she trusted the adults around her to protect what mattered. "Stand down," he ordered his men. "All of you, stand down." Reza Martinez found himself isolated, outnumbered, and facing the choice between backing down or escalating a confrontation he couldn't win. The Marines were professional, the community was united, and even his own gang leadership was abandoning him. For the first time in his criminal career, Reza Martinez chose retreat over violence. As the gang vehicles departed, Marcus Torres remained in the street, facing a community he'd terrorized and Marines he'd challenged. When Frank Morrison approached him, Marcus expected condemnation or demands for surrender. Instead, the old Marine extended his hand. "Son," Frank said quietly, "it's never too late to choose a different path." Marcus Torres looked at the offered hand, then at the community center where children were already returning to their interrupted activities, then at the Marines who'd created space for hope to flourish. For the first time in 14 years, Marcus Torres chose trust over suspicion, cooperation over control, and the possibility of redemption over the certainty of continued conflict. The test was over. The community had faced its greatest threat and emerged stronger, but the real work, building lasting change, was just beginning. The real work, building lasting change, was just beginning. In the aftermath of the confrontation, as children returned to their interrupted activities and Marines maintained their protective positions, Marcus Torres found himself standing in the middle of a street that had become the boundary between his old life and an uncertain future. Detective Carlos Mendez arrived within minutes of the standoff's conclusion, his patrol car followed by 2 additional units and a supervisor who'd been monitoring the situation from a distance. But instead of the chaotic crime scene he'd expected, Mendez found something unprecedented: a former gang leader voluntarily surrendering to community authority rather than law enforcement jurisdiction. "Mr. Torres," Mendez approached carefully, his hand resting on his weapon but not drawing it, "we need to discuss what happens next." Marcus looked around at the neighborhood he'd controlled through fear for over a decade, seeing it clearly. For perhaps the first time, children were playing in streets he'd turned into drug corridors. Elderly residents were sitting on porches he'd made into no-go zones. Small businesses were operating without paying tribute to his organization. "Detective, I need to make this right," Marcus said quietly. "All of it." Frank Morrison, still moving carefully due to his injuries, joined the conversation with Elena, Morales and Staff Sergeant Vasquez. The unlikely group formed a circle that represented every stakeholder in Riverside Heights' transformation: law enforcement, military, community advocacy, and reformed criminal leadership. Marcus, Frank's voice carried the authority of someone who'd seen men face their worst moments and choose better paths. Making it right starts with truth, about your organization, about the crimes, about everyone who's been hurt by the choices you've made. Elena pulled out a notebook she'd been carrying since the crisis began. "We've been documenting everything: protection, rackets, intimidation tactics, businesses forced to close, families driven out of the neighborhood. If you're serious about redemption, you need to help us understand the full scope of what we're dealing with." Marcus nodded slowly. "I'll tell you everything, but I need guarantees about my people, the ones who want out, who never wanted to be part of the violence. They need protection and alternatives, not just prison sentences." Detective Mendez considered the implications. Traditional law enforcement would demand arrests, prosecutions, and lengthy prison terms for everyone involved in Red Serpent activities. But traditional law enforcement had also failed to protect Riverside Heights for over a decade. "I can't make promises about immunity," Mendez said carefully, "but I can promise that cooperation will be considered in any prosecutions and that we'll work with community advocates to develop alternatives for low-level offenders who demonstrate genuine commitment to change." Staff Sergeant Vasquez added her own perspective. What we've established here only works if it's sustainable. That means addressing root causes, not just symptoms. People join gangs for reasons: lack of opportunity, need for protection, absence of positive role models. We need to address those factors, or we'll just be creating space for the next gang to move in. My parents risked everything to give their children better choices, David told a group of former Red Serpents completing job training programs. I almost threw that away because I thought gang membership was the only way to protect what I loved. Don't make my mistakes. The Marine presence had evolved from emergency response to sustainable community partnership. Staff Sergeant Maria Vasquez had been promoted and assigned to develop community engagement protocols based on the Riverside Heights experience. The program was being implemented at military installations nationwide, providing returning veterans with meaningful ways to serve their communities while addressing their own transition challenges. We learned that serving the community serves the Marines too, Maria explained to a visiting congressional delegation. Veterans struggling with post-deployment adjustment find purpose in protecting civilians who need what we have to offer. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson had been promoted to full colonel and put in charge of the military's new community partnership initiatives. The success at Riverside Heights had demonstrated that military skills could address domestic challenges without creating the civil-military tensions that had concerned constitutional scholars. The most important lesson, Patterson testified before a Senate subcommittee, is that military involvement in community protection requires civilian leadership, legal oversight, and clear boundaries. We provide security and technical expertise. Communities provide leadership and long-term vision. Detective Carlos Mendez had been promoted to sergeant and assigned to head the police department's new community partnership division. Crime rates in Riverside Heights had dropped by 70%, but more importantly, community cooperation with law enforcement had increased dramatically. When people trust that calling police will actually help rather than just create paperwork, they're willing to report crimes and provide information, Mendez explained to other law enforcement agencies studying the model. Community policing works when the community believes police are actually part of their community. But the most meaningful change was visible in the children. Amy Chen had started college with a full scholarship, planning to study social work and return to help other communities replicate Riverside Heights' success. The 8-year-old who'd called Frank Morrison Abuelo Frank was now reading at grade level for the first time, her confidence growing alongside her neighborhood's stability. Tommy Morrison had found healing through service, his PTSD symptoms manageable as long as he remained connected to meaningful work protecting others. He'd started a non-profit organization that connected veterans with community service opportunities, using the Riverside Heights model as proof that former warriors could become community builders. Frank Morrison, now 86 and moving more, slowly but with undiminished dignity, spent his mornings tending an expanded garden that fed 3 neighboring families, and his afternoons mentoring young Marines learning community engagement skills. Rosa would have been proud, he said to Elena as they watched children play in the park that had been reclaimed from drug dealers. She always believed that ordinary people could do extraordinary things if they just refused to accept the unacceptable. The transformation was holding, growing, and inspiring similar efforts in communities across the country. But as Frank often reminded visitors, the real work wasn't in the dramatic moments of crisis and confrontation. The real work was in the daily choice to build something better than what existed before. Riverside Heights had proven that such building was possible. Riverside Heights had proven that such building was possible. 1 year after the attack that changed everything, Frank Morrison stood in his garden at dawn, watching the sun rise over a neighborhood transformed beyond recognition. The anniversary celebration filled the community center and spilled into streets that buzzed with life rather than threat. Frank had received formal recognition from the Marine Corps, the city, and 3 community organizations, but the honors that mattered most were simpler. Children calling him grandfather, former, gang members seeking his counsel, neighbors stopping by just to check on his well-being. Marcus Torres took the podium at the ceremony, his presence drawing silence from a crowd that included many who'd once feared him. A year ago, I thought strength meant making people afraid. Frank Morrison taught me that real strength means giving people reasons to hope. The Riverside Heights model had spread to 47 communities nationwide. Captain Rodriguez, now Major Rodriguez, directed the military's Community Partnership Initiative from the Pentagon. Elena Morales had been appointed to the Mayor's Community Development Council. Detective Mendez supervised similar police programs in 6 cities. But Frank remained focused on the daily work of community building. His house still served as an unofficial headquarters where Marines coordinated with civilians, where former criminals found mentorship, where neighbors solved problems together. David Chen's sister Amy returned from her first semester of college, already planning graduate studies in community development. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "you changed everything for my family." Frank shook his head gently. "Child, I just refused to move when someone tried to push me. Everything else happened because good people decided to stand together." As evening settled over Riverside Heights, Frank sat on his porch as he had every night for 40 years. But now children played. Safely in the street, neighbors called out greetings, and the sound of laughter carried farther than fear. Rosa's roses bloomed brighter than ever, and Frank Morrison, Marine, mentor, and symbol of ordinary courage, creating extraordinary change, smiled as he watched his community choose hope over fear, protection over predation, and love over abandonment. The legacy would endure because it had been built not on one man's courage, but on a community's refusal to accept the unacceptable. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.